200 civilizations never spoke to each other. They lived on different continents, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods. And every single one of them wrote down the same catastrophe, word for word, detail for detail. This is not a coincidence. This is the most important story ever told. And you are about to find out why nobody told you the truth about
the flood myth.
Every culture that has ever existed on this planet left behind art, tools, laws, and stories. Most of those stories are local. They reflect the landscape, the climate, the specific fears and hopes of the people who created them. They belong to one place and one time. But there is one story that belongs to everyone. 200 cultures, every inhabited continent, every major language family, every religious tradition, and all of them, independently, wrote down the same catastrophe, the same warning, the same vessel, the same survival, the same world that came after, diminished and changed, carrying the memory of everything that was lost. Not a similar story, the same story. And here is what makes that impossible to dismiss. These cultures did not trade texts. They did not share trade routes. Many of them were separated by oceans that no ship of their era could cross. Some of them were isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years. By every measure of historical contact that scholars possess, they simply could not have passed this story from one to another. And yet, it is there, in all of them. Waiting in the next 30 minutes, you are going to see this story reconstructed from the original ancient texts themselves. No invented details, no speculation dressed up as history. Only what the sources actually say. And what they say is already stranger, older, and more precise than anything that could have been invented. By the time this video ends, the question will not be whether this story is real. The question will be what humanity was so desperate across every civilization that has ever existed to never forget.
Part 1. The discovery that broke the history.
In 1872, a translator working alone in the British Museum put down a fragment of ancient clay, stood up from his desk, and started removing his clothes. His name was George Smith, and what he had just read would crack the foundation of everything Western civilization believed about its own origins. The fragment was part of tablet the 11th of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Recovered from the ruins of the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal in ancient Nineveh, buried under rubble for more than 2,000 years, and what it described was a flood, a divine warning delivered in secret, a vessel built to survive the destruction of the world, birds sent out to find dry land, a mountain where the boat finally rested, a survivor who received a blessing from the gods. It was the biblical flood, word for word, detail for detail, written 2,000 years before the book of Genesis existed. The reaction was not academic curiosity, it was institutional panic. The Times of London ran the story. The British government took notice. The British Museum funded a full expedition to Iraq to find the missing fragments. Smith led it himself. And within days of arriving at the ruins of Nineveh, he found exactly what he needed. Within days, at a site covering acres of ancient rubble, that detail alone made his contemporaries uncomfortable. But what the fragments confirmed was worse than anyone had anticipated. The parallels between tablets, She, and Genesis were not general or loosely interpretive. They were structural, sequential, precise. The same birds sent out in the same order, the same mountain. The same sacrifice offered by the survivor the moment the waters receded. The same divine response to that sacrifice, too precise to be coincidence, too detailed to be independent invention. What the Assyriologists who followed Smith eventually concluded was something far more unsettling than simple borrowing. Both the Sumerian account and the biblical account appeared to be drawing from something older than either of them. A source so ancient that by the time the scribes of Babylon and the authors of Genesis encountered it, it had already been in circulation for centuries. Neither version is the original, both are copies of something that came before. And here is where you have to stop and sit with that for a moment. Because if both accounts are copies, then somewhere behind them there is an original tap, something recorded or remembered or transmitted before Sumer, before Genesis. Before any civilization we currently recognize as the starting point of human history, the Sumerians themselves did not write about the flood as something that happened to them. They wrote about it as something that happened to their ancestors. As history so distant, it had already passed into legend by the time the first clay tablets were pressed. Which means the event at the center of this story is not just older than the Bible, it is older than writing itself. Something happened. Something so total, so catastrophic, so impossible to forget that the oldest literate civilization in human history was still trying to make sense of it thousands of years after it occurred. And when they finally wrote it down, they did what every culture that preserved this memory did. They wrapped it in God's and divine judgment and sacred vessels. Not to deceive, but because that was the only language powerful enough to make sure it survived, and survive it did. In ways that George Smith, standing in that museum in 1872, removing his jacket in a state of complete agitation, could not yet fully imagine.
Part 2, 200 Cultures That Never Met.
Once scholars started looking for other versions of the flood myth, they could not stop finding them. Not 2, not 10, not 50. More than 200 independent versions of the same story, cataloged across every inhabited continent on Earth. The index compiled at sacred-texts.com lists flood myths from Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, India, China, Japan, Scandinavia, the British Isles, Sub-Saharan, Africa, Australia, Polynesia, North America, Central America, and South America. Cultures that had no ships capable of crossing oceans when these stories were first recorded, cultures with no writing systems that could have transmitted the story from one to another, cultures that, by every measure of historical contact we possess, simply never spoke to each other. And yet, the story is there, in all of them. The standard academic response to this is diffusion. The idea that a story travels along trade routes, passed from one culture to the next over centuries, spreading across the world like a slow wave, it is a reasonable theory. It explains a great deal about how myths move between neighboring civilizations, but diffusion has a hard limit. It requires contact. It requires a chain of transmission that leaves traces. When you look at the flood myths of the indigenous peoples of Australia, isolated from the rest of the world for more than 40,000 years, diffusion does not hold when you find the same story in cultures separated not just by geography, but by tens of thousands of years of complete isolation. The transmission theory begins to collapse under its own weight. Joseph Campbell, the American mythologist who spent 38 years at Sarah Lawrence College, asking one question, why do cultures that never met keep telling the same stories, found something he could not explain away, documented across his 4-volume work, The Masks of God, available for free loan at archive.org. Campbell identified a pattern so consistent across unconnected civilizations that coincidence and transmission alone could not account for it. His conclusion was that certain myths emerge independently from the same psychological foundation that all human beings share. He called these patterns archetypes, structures so deeply embedded in human consciousness that they surface spontaneously wherever human beings exist. It is a powerful explanation, and it accounts for much of what we see, but not all of it. Archetypes explain why every culture has a flood myth. They explain the emotional shape of the story. What archetypes do not explain are the operational details. The same bird, sent out in the same sequence, performing the same navigational function, appearing in versions with no possible line of transmission between them. A warning delivered in secret by a god defying the will of a divine council. A vessel sealed with pitch. A mountain where the boat comes to rest. These are not emotional patterns. These are specific, technical, repeatable details that have no business being identical across cultures that never met. Campbell himself acknowledged this tension openly. The psychological framework explained the shape of the myth. It did not explain why someone in Mesopotamia and someone in the Amazon basin, separated by an ocean and thousands of years, included the same bird, in the same role, at the same moment, in the same story. There is a third possibility, one that is less comfortable than either diffusion or archetypes. That the details are identical because the event was identical. That what you are reading across 200 cultures is not mythology, it is testimony, preserved in the only medium that survives the complete collapse of a civilization. a story told by everyone who was there.
Part 3, the God who destroyed, is the same one who saved.
There is a detail buried inside the oldest version of the flood story that almost every retelling quietly skips. Not because it is hard to find, it is right there in the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest written texts in human existence. Available in full through the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at etcsl.or in st.ox.ac.uk. It is skipped because of what it implies. The God who ordered the destruction of humanity and the God who secretly warned the survivor were not enemies. They were members of the same divine council. And in the Atrahasis account, the god Enkidu whispered the warning to Atrahasis through a reed wall so he could claim he had not technically spoken to a human. Was one of the gods who had already voted in favor of the flood. He voted for the destruction. Then he undermined it, not out of rebellion, not out of compassion in any straightforward sense, but because of something the text describes with uncomfortable honesty. Atrahasis was Enki's creation, his specific project, and Enki was not willing to see his work erased, even after agreeing, in the divine assembly, that erasing it was the right decision. Think about what that means. The God who saved humanity did not save humanity because humanity deserved to be saved. He saved it because he was not willing to admit that something he built could be destroyed. The survival of the human race, in the oldest version of this story we possess, was a byproduct of divine ego. That is a radically different moral framework than the one most people associate with flood mythology. In the biblical version, Noah is chosen because he is righteous. The survival of humanity is a moral statement. In the Atrahasis epic, the moral logic is completely absent. Humanity survives not because it deserved to, but because one God refused to fully honor a decision he had already agreed to, and he did it through a technicality, specifically to avoid accountability to the other gods. The Sumerian gods were not omnipotent moral authorities. They were a political body. They voted, they argued, they made collective decisions, and then quietly worked around them when those decisions became personally inconvenient. The divine council in the Atrahasis epic functions less like a supreme moral authority and more like a committee in which individual members pursue their own agendas while nominally agreeing to collective decisions. Now, here is the detail that makes this historically significant, rather than just philosophically interesting. Mircea Eliade, the Romanian-American historian of religions, whose work, Myth and Reality, examined how ancient cultures encoded genuine historical memory into mythological narrative, argued that internal contradictions within a myth are almost never accidental. When a story preserves a detail that undermines its own moral framework, that detail is usually older than the framework itself. It survived the editing process because it was too deeply embedded in the original tradition to remove without destroying the story entirely. The detail of Enki's contradiction does not fit the moral logic of divine punishment and reward. It fits something messier and more recognizably human, a powerful entity making a decision, privately reconsidering it, and finding a way around it without openly admitting the change of heart. That is not theology, that is politics. And the fact that it survived intact in the oldest version of this story, unchanged across thousands of years of retelling, suggests that whoever first recorded it was not constructing a moral lesson. They were preserving something they remembered, something specific enough and internally contradictory enough that no one inventing a clean theological narrative would have included it. Clean theological narratives do not feature gods who betray their own votes through reed wall technicalities. Complicated historical memories do.
Part 4, Greece, India, and the Maya, versions that change everything.
The Sumerian account is the oldest written version we possess. But to understand what this story meant to the civilizations that preserved it, you have to look at what three completely unconnected cultures did with the same raw material. What they kept, what they changed, and what those changes reveal about each civilization's deepest beliefs. Start with Greece. In the Greek account available at theoi.com, the survivor is Deucalion, son of Prometheus, the titan who gave fire to humanity. Zeus decides to destroy the human race. Prometheus warns his son. Deucalion builds a simple chest, just large enough for himself and his wife, 9 days floating. The chest lands on Mount Parnassus, and they step out with nothing. No animals, no seeds, no tools. Just two people on a mountain in a world wiped completely clean. An oracle tells them to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders. They stand in confusion. Then Deucalion understands. The earth is their mother. The stones are her bones. They throw stones, and the stones become people. The Greeks did not honor careful preparation in their survivor. They honored the capacity to think clearly when everything is gone. Now, India, in the Hindu account preserved in the Matsya Purana at sacred-texts.com, a man named Manu is washing his hands in a river when a small fish swims into his palms and asks for protection. He takes it home, feeds it, moves it to larger containers as it grows. Never asks why. When the fish finally fills the ocean, it reveals itself as Vishnu and warns Manu of the coming flood. The instruction is simple. Fill your vessel with the seeds of every plant on earth. Not gold, not weapons, seeds. Manu did not know the fish was a god. He protected it anyway. That instinct, so ordinary it barely registers as a virtue, is what saves the entire world in the Hindu version, followed by the Maya, and here everything changes. The Popo VA available at Gutenberg.org does not describe one flood. It describes four ends. 4 failed attempts by the gods to create a satisfactory humanity. The first humans were made from mud and dissolved. The second from wood and felt nothing. Each destruction was not punishment. It was a design revision. The current humanity, the 5th attempt, was made from maize. These humans could see so clearly that the gods grew worried. So they placed a veil over human vision, not as punishment, as calibration. You are living in the 5th attempt right now. 3 cultures, 3 completely different conclusions from the same raw event. The Greeks honored clarity of thought under devastation. The Hindus honored the protection of the vulnerable. The Maya saw the destruction itself not as catastrophe, but as process. None of them were wrong. All of them were looking at the same thing from a different angle.
Part 5. The bird detail that should not exist.
Strip away the gods, strip away the theology and the moral frameworks and the centuries of retelling. Take all of that away and look only at what remains at the structural core of the myth across its 200 versions. What you find is surprisingly small. A vessel, a flood, a survivor, a mountain, and a bird. Not a symbol of a bird. Not a vague reference to flight or freedom. A specific bird sent out from the vessel in a specific sequence, performing a specific function, and returning with a specific result. That precise operational detail appears in the Sumerian version, in the biblical version, in Hindu versions, and in accounts from cultures as geographically distant from Mesopotamia as it is possible to be while still living on the same planet. In tablet the 11th of the Epic of Gilgamesh at sacred-texts.com, Utnapishtim sends out a dove, it returns, then a swallow. It returns, then a raven. The raven does not return. Land has been found. In Genesis, Noah sends a raven first, then a dove 3 times. The 3rd time, the dove does not return. Same structural logic. A bird sent out, its failure to return is the message. That is not poetry. That is a navigation technique. Anyone who has spent time at sea knows that birds were used as navigational tools long before any instrument existed. A bird released over open water will fly toward the nearest landmass if one is within range. If it returns, there is no land within reach. If it does not return, land has been found. This technique was documented among Norse sailors, Polynesian navigators, and ancient Indian seafarers. It was practical, reliable, and old. The presence of this detail in the flood myth is not metaphorical, it is technical. Whoever was at the center of this event was using birds as navigational instruments, and the people who first recorded the story understood that detail well enough to preserve it across thousands of years of retelling. Now consider what it means for that detail to appear in versions with no possible line of transmission between them. James George Fraser, the Scottish anthropologist whose systematic cataloging of world mythology across his life's work, The Golden Bow, is available in full at Gutenberg. Org noted that the bird detail appears in flood accounts from Pacific Island cultures and indigenous North American traditions that had no conceivable contact with Mesopotamian sources. His conclusion was careful. He noted the parallel without fully explaining it, because there is no fully satisfying explanation. If the detail traveled through diffusion, it reached places that were geographically unreachable by any known transmission route. If it emerged independently, then multiple cultures independently invented the same specific navigational technique and independently decided to place it in their flood accounts at the same moment in the narrative, performing the same function. The probability of that being coincidence is not zero, but it is small enough to demand a better explanation. There is one explanation that accounts for the bird appearing in unreachable places with its technical precision intact. That the people who carried this story there were there. That they did not receive it through transmission. That they brought it with them because they lived it, because they sent the bird out themselves and watched it not come back and understood exactly what that meant. The bird was not a symbol. The bird was real, and the hand that released it belonged to someone who needed to know, in the most practical sense possible, whether the world still existed beyond the edge of the water.
Part 6. The Black Sea's memory that traveled in every direction.
Everything discussed so far has lived in the territory of ancient texts, clay tablets, sacred books, oral traditions preserved across millennia, compelling and historically significant, but ultimately literary. Words written by people about things they believed, or remembered, or inherited from those who came before them. This topic is different. This topic is about ice. In 1997, two marine geologists from Columbia University named William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a theory that was, at the time, considered by much of the academic establishment to be ambitious to the point of provocation. Their argument, developed from years of sediment core analysis in the Black Sea region, was simple in its outline and staggering in its implications. The Black Sea was not always a sea. Before approximately 5,600 BC, the body of water that today connects to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus Strait was an inland freshwater lake, significantly smaller than its current size, sitting well below Mediterranean sea level. The land surrounding it was fertile, temperate, and heavily populated. Farming communities had been established along its shores for thousands of years. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, one of the most livable places on Earth. Then, the Ice Age ended. Sea levels rose, the Mediterranean pressed against the natural land barrier at the Bosphorus, and at some point, the barrier gave way. Ryan and Pittman's research suggested that when the Bosphorus collapsed, the volume of water pouring through was approximately 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls. The freshwater lake became a saltwater sea in a period measured not in centuries but potentially in months. The shoreline advanced inland at a rate that communities could not outrun gradually. They had to move immediately, permanently, in every direction available to them: north, south, east, west. And they carried the memory with them, north into the Eurasian steppe, where their descendants eventually reached Scandinavia and produced the Norse flood account preserved. In the poetic Edda at sacred-texts.com, south and east into Mesopotamia, where the memory merged with Sumerian literary culture and became the Atrahasis epic and eventually Tablet the 11th of Gilgamesh. West into the Aegean, where it became the story of Deucalion east toward the Indian subcontinent, where it entered the oral traditions eventually recorded in the Matsya Purana, one catastrophe, one dispersal, stories carried in every direction by people who had no other choice but to run. What is not in dispute is the geology itself. The sediment cores from the floor of the Black Sea tell a clear story. Below a specific layer, freshwater organisms; above it, saltwater organisms. The transition is geologically abrupt, and the land that sits under the northern shelf of the Black Sea today was once dry land, inhabited dry land. There are accounts of underwater researchers who have identified what appear to be ancient shorelines and structural remnants in the shallow waters of the Black Sea's northern shelf. At depths consistent with the pre-flood lake level described in Ryan and Pittman's model, those findings remain preliminary, but they exist. The flood did not come from the imagination of ancient priests. It came from the water, From the specific, documented, geologically verifiable experience of watching an entire world disappear beneath a sea that had not existed when those people were children, and the people who watched it happen ran in every direction, and they never stopped telling their children what they had seen. The story traveled because the people who lived it traveled, and they traveled because they had no other choice.
Part 7. What every version agrees that happened after the flood.
The flood ends, the water recedes, the survivor steps off the vessel onto dry ground and looks at what remains of the world. This is the moment every version of the myth eventually reaches. And it is the moment that receives the least attention in popular retellings, because what comes after the flood is not dramatic in the way that the flood itself is dramatic, but it is the most revealing part of the entire story, because every version agrees on what the world looked like after the water left, and what they agree on is not reassuring. The world that came after was smaller, shorter, less, every culture that preserved this myth. Without exception, among the versions that describe the post-flood world in any detail, describes the age that followed as inferior to the age that preceded it. Human lifespans shortened. The direct relationship between gods and humans was severed. The knowledge and clarity that had existed before the destruction was partially or entirely lost. The Sumerian king list, available in full at the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at etcsl.org or in st.ox.ac.uk, makes this contrast with almost mathematical precision. Before the flood, kings reign for tens of thousands of years. Alulam of Eridu reigns for 28,800 years. 8 kings rule for a combined total of 241,200 years. Then the flood comes, and after it, the first post-flood king reigns for 1,200 years. Then the numbers drop further. Then further still. Within a few generations, the reigns are measured in centuries. Then decades. The document is tracking something its authors clearly believed was real. A world winding down from something greater towards something lesser. A progressive shortening of human capacity across every generation that followed the flood. Genesis tells the same story through genealogy. Before the flood, the patriarchs live for centuries. Adam lives for 930 years. Methuselah reaches 969. After the flood, the lifespans begin their long decline. Abraham lives to 175, Moses to 120. By the time the narrative reaches the historical period, human lifespans have reached their current range. The flood is the turning point. The moment after which human beings began to live and die at the scale we now consider normal. The Hindu tradition frames this same decline in cosmic terms through the concept of the Yugas, the great ages of the world described in the Puranic texts at sacred-texts.com. The first age was an era of perfect virtue and direct communion with the divine. Each subsequent age is shorter and less complete than the one before it. The current age, the Kali Yuga, is the shortest and most degraded. The flood marks the boundary between the earlier, higher ages and the long descent toward the present. What does it mean that every culture that preserved the flood myth also preserved the memory of a better world that existed before it? Mircea Eliade, the historian of religions whose work examined the structure of mythological time across cultures, argued that this universal nostalgia for a lost golden age is one of the most consistent features of human religious thought across all known civilizations. Every culture looks backward toward an origin time that was more complete, more connected, more fully human than the present. But there is a difference between philosophical nostalgia and a numerically precise record of declining human lifespans that appears independently in Sumerian, Hebrew, and Hindu traditions. Philosophical nostalgia is vague. It says the past was better without specifying how. What the flood myths say is precise. The past was better by specific measurable amounts. And the flood was the exact moment when everything began its long decline. They were not mourning an imaginary paradise. They were documenting a loss. And whatever was lost in that flood, whatever that higher world actually contained, the people who survived it spent the rest of human history trying to remember it clearly enough to write it down.
Part 8. The question that science still cannot answer.
At this point, you have traveled through 7 distinct layers of this myth. You have read what the oldest texts actually say. You have followed the geological evidence. You have watched the same story surface in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. You have seen the bird, the mountain, the chosen survivor, the diminished world that came after. And now it is time to be honest about where all of that evidence actually leaves us. The honest answer is not satisfying, and any video that tells you otherwise is selling you something. The flood myth is one of the most studied subjects in the entire history of comparative mythology. Generations of rigorous academic minds in Assyriology, anthropology, geology, climatology, and archaeology have devoted careers to understanding it. And the current state of that collective knowledge can be summarized in two columns: what has been explained and what has not. What has been explained is considerable. The diffusion theory accounts for the similarities between the Mesopotamian Bib and the Plusopodine and biblical accounts with reasonable precision. The Black Sea hypothesis provides a plausible physical anchor for the concentration of flood. Myths and cultures surrounding that region. Joseph Campbell's framework of universal archetypes, documented across his life's work, available at archive.org, explains why emotionally similar stories emerge independently in psychologically similar human minds. The geological record of post-glacial sea level rise, which inundated vast inhabited coastal regions between roughly 12,000 and 5,000 years ago, provides a broad physical context within which multiple independent flood memories could have originated. These explanations are real. They are evidence-based. They account for a significant portion of what we observe, but not all of it. The bird detail, sent out in the same sequence, performing the same navigational function, appearing in cultures with no possible line of transmission to Mesopotamia. The archetype framework explains emotional similarity but not operational specificity. Post-glacial sea level rise does not explain why the specific narrative details, the vessel, the birds, the mountain, the chosen survivor, are so consistent across versions that emerged from regions with entirely different flooding experiences. There is a specific pattern that no current theory fully accounts for. Not the 200 versions themselves. The 5 elements. Across those 200 versions, in cultures that cannot be connected by any known transmission route, the same 5 structural elements appear in the same sequence: destruction by water, divine warning to one individual, construction of a vessel, animal preservation, survival on elevated ground. 5 elements, same sequence, 200 times. James George Fraser, whose systematic cataloging of world mythology in the Golden Bow at Gutenberg.org remains one of the most comprehensive surveys ever attempted, documented this consistency without fully resolving it. He noted the pattern carefully, and he acknowledged, in the measured language of a scholar who understood the limits of his own evidence, that the existing frameworks did not fully account for what he was observing. That acknowledgement was made over a century ago. And the frameworks available to researchers today, while significantly more sophisticated, have not closed the gap he identified. They have narrowed it. They have explained portions of it. But the core of the problem remains. 200 cultures, 5 elements, same sequence, no complete explanation. What science has given us is not an answer. It is a progressively more detailed map of a question that keeps expanding the more carefully it is examined. Every explanation that accounts for one layer of the mystery reveals another layer underneath it. Something happened. Every culture remembered it. And the clearest thing science can tell us today, after a century and a half of serious investigation, is that we do not yet fully understand how a story this specific, this consistent, and this technically precise traveled to every corner of a world that had no way to transmit it. That is not a failure of science. It is an honest assessment of how much of human prehistory remains genuinely unknown. And it is an invitation to keep looking. To keep reading the texts that have been waiting, in clay and parchment and oral tradition, for someone to finally ask the right question, because the answer is almost certainly already there. Buried in the same place all the other answers have been waiting, in the story itself.
Epilogue. It's not about the water, it's about renewal.
And then, it ends. The survivor steps off the vessel. The world begins again. And here, at the end of this journey through 200 versions of the same story, There is one final observation to make. One that requires no academic citation. One that is visible to anyone who reads these texts carefully and honestly, regardless of their background or their tradition. The flood myth is not about water. It never was. Water is the mechanism, the instrument of destruction that every culture reached for when they needed to describe the complete erasure of a world. But the story was never about what destroyed everything. It was always about what one person chose to carry through the destruction into whatever came next. Think about what Utnapishtim took onto his vessel. The Epic of Gilgamesh at sacred-texts.com is specific. He took his family. He took the craftsmen of his city, the people who knew how to build things. He took the seed of every living creature. He did not take armies. He did not take weapons. He did not take the instruments of power that made him a king. He took the instruments of continuation, the things without which the next world could not begin. Think about what Manu took. Seeds, not treasures, not armies. The compressed potential of every living thing that had existed before the destruction, small enough to carry, powerful enough to rebuild an entire world from nothing. Think about what Noah took. 2 of every creature. Not the strongest, not the most economically valuable. Every creature. The instruction was not to preserve what was most important. It was to preserve everything. To make no judgment about what the next world would need, because no one who had lived in the old world could fully imagine what the new one would require. And think about what Deucalion took. Nothing. Just himself and his wife and the willingness to follow an instruction he did not fully understand. He rebuilt humanity from stones, from the raw material of the earth itself. From nothing but the capacity to act clearly when everything else was gone. What all 4 of these survivors carried through the end of the world was not gold, not power, not the accumulated wealth of the civilization that was destroyed. They carried seeds, they carried knowledge, they carried the capacity to begin again. 200 cultures, without ever speaking to each other, built their most sacred survival story around the same central act. Not fighting, not conquering, not accumulating, preserving, protecting, carrying forward, through total destruction, the things without which the next world cannot exist. That is not a coincidence of mythology. That is a consensus of human wisdom across every civilization that has ever existed on this planet. And it raises a question worth carrying with you after this video ends. If every culture that ever lived through catastrophe independently concluded that the thing most worth preserving is not power or wealth, but seeds and knowledge and the capacity to begin again, what does that tell you about what actually matters? Not philosophically, practically, in the specific, grounded, daily sense of what you choose to protect and what you choose to let go. The flood survivors did not mourn what was lost. They could not afford to. The water was still rising. They had a vessel and they had a choice, and they made it quickly, and they did not look back. They looked forward, toward a mountain they could not yet see, carrying everything the next world would need, and nothing the old world had convinced them they could not live without. The story was never about the water. It was never about the destruction. It was never even about the survival. It was about the choice. The single, defining, irrevocable, human choice of what to carry when everything else is gone. 200 cultures remembered that choice. They wrapped it in gods and floods and divine judgment because that was the only language powerful enough to make sure their children never forgot it, and their children never did. You are the proof of that. You are here thousands of years after the last version of this story was first told, still listening, still carrying it forward. That is what the flood survivor was asked to do. And, without ever being asked, so are you. If you like the myth, don't forget to check out the other videos, hit the subscribe button, and follow for more.